Writing about the evils of racial segregation, Howard Thurman once wrote that hatred often begins in a situation in which there's contact without fellowship. In a time of online banking, self-checkout lines, and fast food, intimacy is often sacrificed for the sake of convenience. Contexts in which fellowship could be built, whether in a conversation with a bank teller, listening to a story from a cashier, or spending time with friends and family in the kitchen, are slowly diminishing, and with them, a greater sense of connectedness. The problem is that when I lack the ability to see my connection to others, it becomes much easier to cut ties, to stereotype, to demonize others, or to even become conflict averse or flighty in my relationships. And as the opportunity for fellowship slowly disappears and our presences continually move from in-person to online, that all too familiar possibility for hatred that Thurman talks about reveals itself again. The possibility to form authentic community becomes improbable at best and impossible at worst. So this semester, we as a campus are exploring how our individual lives with Jesus empower us to live life together. And as the sacrifice of intimacy for convenience continues to blind us to our connectedness to others, life with Jesus invites us to see differently. Rather than to see through the lens of the individual, life with Jesus invites us to view life through the lens of covenant and to adopt what I call covenantal sight. So what is this idea of covenant? And how can it help us to view life together differently? Well, first, you may have heard Christians talk about the relationship with God in a few different ways. I might refer to God as a parent, or God as a friend, or God as a ruler. But the thing with these common descriptions is that they often leave out a type of relationship that's important for the greater biblical narrative. And this is the idea of a covenantal relationship, or a partnership with God. And so this idea of covenantal relationship appears numerous times throughout the Bible. And we actually get a great example in the story of Noah. And so if you don't know the story, not to worry. Basically, God comes down and warns this righteous man named Noah that God is about to destroy the world with a great flood. And he tells Noah to build a boat and to load it with his family and with his animals and with animals around the world. And so Noah does what God tells him to do and builds this boat, loads it with his family and with the animals, and then God destroys the earth with this flood. So after the flood, after God has wiped away the evil of the world, Noah exits the boat, gives a sacrifice to God, and God comes down and makes a covenant with Noah and commands Noah and says, if you will fill the earth, you and your family, I will never do this again. I will never destroy the earth in this way. And so here we get this idea of covenant, a covenant made between God and Noah, a sort of promise. And so there are a few interesting points about this idea of covenant that can be drawn from this story and drawn from other stories as well. God does not just make a covenant with Noah, but also makes covenants with Abraham, with the nation of Israel, with King David. And in each of these situations, in each of these settings, God is not just making a covenant with an individual, but with a group of people. So although God is talking to Noah directly, God is also making God's covenant with Noah and Noah's family and Noah's descendants. And so this idea of covenant is inherently communal. It both puts God in a relationship with a community and a community in a relationship with God. And at the same time, however, and probably most notable for today, covenants between God and people also put human communities in a relationship with one another. So how is this the case? Well, a great way to think about it is a treaty between two nations. And this isn't a perfect analogy, but I think it'll illustrate the point. So if we think of two nations coming together, they come to an agreement that neither will wage war on the other. Neither will allow any group or any people from that nation to attack the other. Well, say, despite this treaty, a small group from nation A attacks nation B. Even though the majority of nation A doesn't agree with the attack, doesn't stand for the attack, doesn't want it to happen, nation A still broke the treaty. They as a collective, they as a community are responsible. And so here we have Nation A breaking the treaty. They failed to uphold their end. So, this being the case, it's not just one individual, one group who is responsible, but the whole nation, the whole community. So if we use this as an analogy for covenant, it kind of works similarly. Covenantal relationships between God and people are not just with individuals, and not a single person or a single group is responsible. The covenant binds everyone within the group together in an agreement to work together to hold up their end. So under life with Jesus, we are bound in a covenant with God. And again, this covenant is not just made with an individual or with a small group of God's people. It's here that when I commit my life to Jesus, I also commit to viewing community through the lens of covenant and recognizing that under covenant, I'm fundamentally connected to those around me. Life with Jesus and the covenant therein helps me to recognize both my connectedness to God and likewise my connectedness to others. And so this brings me back to the idea of covenantal sight. The idea of covenantal sight then is essentially the ability to see myself as part of a greater community committed to God. I am both part of a community that holds a relationship with God and part of a community that holds a web of connected relationships within itself. So when everyday forces try to separate me from those around me, covenantal sight helps me to once again see my connectedness and my responsibility to others. Covenantal sight helps me to see that under covenant to God, we're all in this together. So this week, to help us adopt this idea of covenantal sight and to see ourselves as connected to a community much larger than ourselves, I invite you to read in small groups twice this week, just of 3 or 4 people, of friends or people from class, or even people from your community group. But we'd love for you to read a few scriptures we've collected regarding this idea of covenant. And so this time we want you to take turns reading this scripture. The first time around, we'd love for each of you to read it normally, just taking turns between people in the group. But the second time, we want you to do something a little bit different, something a little unconventional. We would love for you, anytime you encounter a second person singular pronoun, to change it to plural. So when you read in Genesis that Noah says, or God says to Noah, "I establish my covenant with you," you would instead read, "I establish my covenant with you all." And so I know this may sound a little clunky at first, but the repetition of reading the Bible through a communal lens can help us to once again see with covenantal sight. And so at the same time, while we're reading, just twice a week with a group of people, we would love for you to take 10 minutes a day to journal about the experience and to journal about this idea of covenantal sight and to spend some time in reflection. And no worries if journaling is not something that comes natural to you. We've actually prepped a few questions to help you get started. So we hope you'll practice this idea of covenantal sight this week. And we hope that you'll join us next week as we continue to explore life together.